Morning Cafe, and time now for that big interview that you've all been waiting for. We speak to the British High Commissioner to Kenya this morning, Patrick Desmond Neil Wigan. I got it right?
You did.
Oh, perfect. He has been the current British High Commissioner to Kenya since July. That is, he replaced Jane Marriott after she served a 4-year term. Previously, he has been the ambassador to Israel, DR Congo, as well as Somalia. Good morning.
Morning, Flora.
It's good to have you this morning.
Thank you for the invitation.
How are you doing?
Good. Yes, we're still recovering from the royal visit, which was our big thing this year.
Yes.
And looking forward to Christmas.
Oh, yes. How's it been the 6 months you've been here?
More or less, yes. It feels like longer in a way, but it's been so busy, but it's been great to try to get out and about and see as much of Kenya as possible.
Great. And how are you finding Kenya? I saw you visited the likes of Taita Hills, Lamu. How's it been like? And also around 15 counties?
So I think I'm up to 17 now. So I've got a big map up in my office, and every time I go to a new county, then I take it off the map.
Yes.
Because I really want to get out of Nairobi. You can be a diplomat in a little bubble in Nairobi.
Yes.
So I really want to get out and about and just see how different bits of Kenya are. So I was up in tea country, in Kericho and Bomet, and that's something I'd never been before, was completely different. Yes. As you said, down on the Tanzanian border in a totally different countryside and different communities. And then Lamu is a whole different world. So that's been one of the best things about being here.
Great. And what county are you looking at next for the Christmas?
So actually, one of the issues that we're worried about is the El Nino and the flooding that we've seen. So this week I want to go to one of the communities that's been affected by the El Nino floods to see what we can do to help.
Yeah. Awesome, great. And you came out in July, August. Then after coming, very big assignment there. The King made his first visit to Kenya, the maiden visit actually since his coronation, and the first to a Commonwealth country. What is the significance of that trip, and how was it like?
So, as you said, it was his first trip to a Commonwealth country, and I think that shows how strong the UK-Kenya relationship is, but it also shows the royal family's personal connections with Kenya.
Yes.
His mother became queen while she was in Kenya, his son got engaged to his wife in Kenya, and he himself has visited 3 or 4 times officially. So it was a really good fit, but we wanted to use a visit to show how strong the relationship is at the moment. Okay,
great. And even as he visited, it's almost, tomorrow it turns 60 years, as 60 years of independence. Therefore, how do you intend to continue fostering a stronger bilateral ties between Kenya and the UK, even as Kenya hits 60 years of independence?
So we think those ties are really strong at the moment. So 2 weeks ago, I was with the Cabinet Secretary for Defence, and we went to see a Kenyan training facility and a British training facility where our troops can train together to face common threats.
Yes.
So security is an important area, but also we see huge potential in Kenya in areas like technology and science and innovation. So the King, while he was here, met some Kenyan tech entrepreneurs who he was extremely impressed by, and we see huge potential in green investment. So I'm really trying to encourage British firms that want to invest in renewable energy or use Kenya's skill in these areas to come and invest and create jobs and growth here.
Okay, great. And even as you mentioned on matters security, you have served as ambassador to Israel, DR Congo, Somalia, and a common factor in all those countries is the rate of insecurity that is there. Therefore, how do you plan, even before we get to that, your take on the current war that is going on in Hamas and Gaza, as well as the current situation in DR Congo, and what can be done for long-lasting solution?
So the situation in Gaza is terrible. I have Israeli friends who lost family members during the Hamas attacks. I've been to Gaza many times. I have colleagues working in Gaza living in absolutely terrible conditions at the moment. We feel that Hamas was responsible for this conflict, that it started it, but it's really important that the people of Gaza don't suffer, and they're suffering terribly. So we think it's important to have humanitarian pauses and to get the aid in that they need as quickly as possible. For the situation in DR Congo, yes, I'm following it very closely given my background. We think Kenya, by stepping in the East African community, has really played an important part in trying to keep stability. And we hope that things remain peaceful through the elections. And then after that, we can get back to the peace process that was launched here in Nairobi.
Okay, great. And even as you were mentioning that you and the CS for Defense Aiden Duale visited Laikipia, that is a Batuk training center in Laikipia sometime last week. Yeah, and I believe the British Army has done amazing, marvelous job in terms of training, even in their partnership with KDF. But again, the ghost of the past continue to come in, even as for the attributes of what happens to the Kenyan soldiers. So how, in your tenure, do you plan to ensure that there's a long-lasting solution and the perpetrators of these actions are brought to book?
So you're talking about the case of Agnes Wanjiru?
Yes.
Yes, so we think that's a truly terrible case and a tragedy for her and her family. It's the Kenyan police who lead on the investigation, and we've committed that we will cooperate fully with that investigation. Because it's a live investigation, there's not much that I can say about it, but I do want to stress that we are absolutely committed to cooperating with the Kenyan police on this.
Okay, great. Even in your visit, there's a defense cooperation agreement that was signed between Kenya and the UK to ensure that there's robust measures put in place to deal with emerging threats with the Kenyan border. So how will that help even in terms of just beefing up our security and dealing with matters of terrorism?
So we think there's a lot that British and Kenyan troops can learn from each other, and that we should do much more training together, and that's one of the things I talked to CS Duale about. We've both got really good facilities that we can use, and we can share experiences. So our soldiers have been fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and other conflicts. We have a big experience in this region, and I myself have visited Kenyan troops up in Kismayo and seen the dangers that they face, yes. And they do a fantastic role providing security for the region. Mm-hmm. So we think that by sharing our experiences, we can keep all of our citizens safer. And you talked about the insecurity in the region, and we see Kenya's role as a sort of anchor of stability in the region as something really important to support. So Kenya can keep on exporting security and stability to the region and not import insecurity from others.
Okay, great. And let's talk a little bit about climate change. There is the COP28 that is ongoing. We had a very successful African climate summit that was held in Kenya. I believe you had a chance to attend. Yes, so moving forward, there's a strategic partnership between Kenya, the 2020-2025 partnership between Kenya and the UK. Therefore, in terms of even matters climate financing and just supporting Kenya to fight climate change and mitigation, what do you intend to do?
So there's several things. So one is that we want to help Kenya get access to climate finance, and President Ruto has been a big campaigner for this globally, and we really support that. And we thought the African Climate Summit really showcased the potential for that. So we're looking at how we can help Kenya access climate finance, whether it's by using the City of London or us providing technical assistance for things like green bonds. Mm-hmm. But secondly, we think that the private sector needs to play a role. So where, as I said, encouraging British companies to come and invest in Kenya. Mm-hmm. And under the strategic partnership that you talked about, there's some real flagship projects like Nairobi Railway City here in Nairobi, which could be a $3 billion clean investment program, or using Kenya's renewable energy and the Menengai geothermal plant. Yes. Is something that President Ruto himself talked about at COP28 as an example of a really good program. And there's more. There are irrigation projects, clean agriculture projects. Mm-hmm. We think Kenya, with its renewable energy and its tech sector, has real opportunity here to be a model for the rest of Africa. So we'd like to support that.
Fantastic. And away from climate financing, I know the UK has been at the forefront of even having very successful initiatives in terms of dealing with climate change. Therefore, what do you envision as some of the collaborations that we could have between Kenya and the UK to deal with this climate change issue?
So there's some things that we want to do at the global stage. So again, we see President Ruto and sort of really bring Africa's voice to the table. We think that's absolutely vital, and we support that. But then it goes right down to the local level. So when the King came here, we looked at community conservation efforts on the coast, how communities are trying to restore fish and coral. They even sort of made a new artificial coral reef in the King's name, which he watched being launched. So we think there's the whole span from the global to the very, very local, where we can work together. Mm-hmm. And there's some nice things like Kenya, for example, electronic transport. We think Kenya could be a real example of a country converting to electronic bodabodas, to electronic buses and so on. And we put the King in an electric tuk-tuk while he was here. Mm-hmm. But British companies are investing in some of those technologies in Kenya. And at Kenya Innovation Week last week, I saw some of those projects, and I think they're really exciting and important.
Yeah, impressive. How's the Kenya Innovation Week?
It was great.
Yeah.
So I was in Israel before, and Israel is the most sort of tech-advanced country almost in the world. And it felt like I was back in Tel Aviv at times. There was a real buzz in the room. There are people with great ideas, sort of young people who really want to change the world. And it was nice to see I met people from Ghana, from Tanzania, from Nigeria, sort of all coming together and sharing ideas and seeing Kenya as a centre. So I think there's huge potential to do more here. And in things like M-Pesa, Kenya's already shown how it can be really push out technology that can be a model for other countries. Last time we were in Kenya, when we went back to the UK, it felt very backward not having M-Pesa anymore.
Great. And even as we talk Matters Tech, of course, that's where the youth come from. I'm sure even as you were going through some of those exhibitions during the Kenya Innovation Week, most of the ideas are from the youth. So therefore, even as the globe evolves in terms of technological advancements, how does the UK plan to now empower Kenyan youth in terms of creating opportunities for them?
So some of it is about, for example, letting, we really like Kenyans coming to study in our universities. We think that benefits both sides, and that way they can gain skills and experience that they can acquire in the UK and then go back to Kenya. We've offered 700 scholarships for a scheme called the Achieving Scholarship Scheme to help Kenyans do that. British universities and schools have got a strong presence here, and again, that's helping transfer some of those skills over. And then particularly through the British Council, we want to create more collaboration between Kenyan young people and British young people in these areas. Because you're right, technology is, I'm too old for technology. I would go around these tech companies and I'd be the oldest person in the room by 20 years. So we absolutely see that opportunity with the young, highly educated population that you have here.
Okay, great. And in terms of even creating innovation hubs, mentorship programs for Kenyan youth, what is it for the Kenyan youth as far as this partnership is concerned?
So at the High Commission, we have a tech hub with Kenyan sort of tech people designed exactly to do that, to look for opportunities of matching up Kenyan skills and ability with finance or expertise or resources from the UK to put them together and help drive that sector. I think President Ruto talked specifically about the contribution we made in his speech, and last year we were Kenya's international partner at Kenya Innovation Week, and that's a position I really want to keep us at.
Great. And when you speak even of these creating work opportunities and study opportunities for Kenyans, there's still some youth and Kenyans who say they face hurdles when trying even to get the US visa and also going through the IELT tests. How do you intend to make this a little bit less tedious for Kenyans as they try now to find opportunities abroad?
No, so I know that the process is complicated and it's expensive, and that's really frustrating. I think given the reality of the threats of illegal migration that we have, that's probably not going to change. What I would say to people is it's a fair process, so please sort of look at the regulations and the guidance and follow it very closely indeed, and that will really increase your chances of success. But we see there are tens of thousands of Kenyans studying in the UK and working in the UK. So the UK is the second biggest source of remittances to Kenya after the United States, showing that many Kenyans can and do find good jobs in the UK, and as I said, can then come back to Kenya with the skills and experience they've gained.
Okay, great. And let's look at a little bit on matters trade. There is the Kenya and UK signed an economic partnership agreement at around March this year. So how does this agreement aim to address the challenges related to tariffs, matters, market access, regulatory barriers for more conducive trade and investment environment for these two countries? So
essentially it means that almost all Kenyan goods can enter the UK tariff-free. There's more or less free trade, sort of certainly in that direction. So we really want to push bilateral trade. It's worth about £1.5 billion a year at the moment, so we've got back to pre-COVID levels. But I think we can do much more on both sides, whether it's agricultural products in Kenya. We think there's a big market to do much more, but we think there are, in areas like green investment, there's more that Britain could be sending to Kenya as well. And trade is, one of the good things is trade is roughly in balance at the moment, and we'd like to keep it that way.
Okay, and what specific sectors are you looking into?
So as I say, agriculture very much. There's a huge appetite for everything from coffee, tea, flowers. I think more than half the tea drunk in Britain is Kenyan, so that shows that that the Kenyan brand is very strong in Britain. So I think there's scale to do more of that. But I think, as I say, we'd like to see Kenya move up the value chain, so do more processing and also move into some of these high-tech areas that we talked about and start sending those to Britain as well.
Okay, perfect. And how will this partnership promote sustainability, innovation, as well as digital transformation to enhance the competitiveness, not only in the region, but also globally?
So we talked about renewable energy, and one of Kenya's key sources of comparative advantage is renewable energy. And President Ruto was talking about this at COP. So we think there are areas, for example, data centers, where it's very attractive to companies now to say that data centers use a lot of energy. So if Kenya can provide data centers using renewable energy, that will help countries meet their green requirements. Then there's diversification of supply chains. People want not to be dependent on China or a particular country anymore. So there's opportunity to do more manufacturing in Kenya so that people can look to new areas. We think agriculture has enormous potential, and we're looking at, for example, at using sustainable energy to power major irrigation projects. And that could create thousands of jobs and millions of dollars of exports.
Okay, perfect. Even as we talk of matters digital transformation, there is a lot of goodwill, even in Kenya, when it comes to matters digital transformation. Let's look at the fintechs here. But I believe the biggest barrier to us is the regulation of those fintechs. Therefore, what can Kenya borrow from the UK in terms of regulating the fintech industry?
So we'd like to do more of sort of helping our expertise in the way we do things, sharing that with Kenya. So for example, the Nairobi International Financial Centre we work very closely with, but the fintech sector in Britain is huge. Financial service is one of our biggest industries, and there's a very long partnership, for example, between the Nairobi Stock Exchange and the London Stock Exchange. So we'd like to really thicken those relationships and help Kenya become a real regional centre for finance, for fintech, and for providing professional services throughout the region, and we think you're well placed to do so. Okay,
perfect. And when it comes to matters trade, the medium and small enterprises are at the core, not only in Kenya but also the UK as well. So how do we ensure, as through this partnership that we have, that they have access mostly on matters market access and also cross-border trade?
So we've done things, for example, working with people in the tech sector or on the fashion sector through the British Council to teach them they've got amazing sort of eyes and amazing talent. So we're helping them with areas like marketing or how do you get access to finance. So you can take these small businesses and make them much more viable and let them scale up a bit more. And again, those are some of the people that we introduced the King to, people working in areas like climate change. And you can see the potential for them to really scale up, and we think we can help with that.
Okay. In terms of agriculture, how can Kenya gain from the UK?
So there are some very deep relationships. So some of the research institutes that you have here have got very close connections with British universities, British research centres, and we think we can play on that. But as I said, also bringing the climate sector in more. So with the CS for Trade, a couple of weeks ago, we signed a memorandum of understanding for what could be a $1 billion agricultural project with a company called United Green, which would enable massive agricultural exports and much more agricultural processing as well. And again, when I was in counties like Kericho and Bomet, they really talked about how they want to move up the value chain. And we think bringing British companies in can help with processing and producing higher value goods.
Great. And there's the issue of even including tech in matters agriculture. I'm sure you visited Kericho, the beautiful tea plantations there. Therefore, how can we peg tech now to make our agriculture even more easier to do?
So sometimes, I mean, in any sector, regulation is always a challenge. And I think Kenya needs to look at the sort of the volume of regulation and also how it does regulation. So one of the frustrations that British companies have is that things move very slowly. Sometimes getting all the permits in place can take quite a long time. And particularly when we're in a world of higher interest rates, of rising prices and the weakening shilling, that means some of the projects that we want to work on have become much more expensive for Kenya just because of the time taken. So I think that's one thing we would encourage is you need to have proper regulation, but we would try to make it faster, more transparent and simpler.
Okay, great. And I see someone here, there's a viewer is asking us now, even though the High Court has ruled against plans to relocate migrants to Rwanda, there are people who are uncomfortable with that plan. Perhaps could the High Commissioner elaborate to us about this move and the potential implications?
So we have a big problem with illegal immigration at the moment, and particularly with people getting on boats to cross the English Channel, which is hugely dangerous for them and is putting money in the hands of criminal gangs who are putting them at risk. So we're trying to create a scheme which will discourage people from doing that. But we are a country which obeys the rule of law, so our courts are ruling on this and saying, no, you need to do this in the right way to make sure that it's compliant with international human rights law. And we're working with the government of Rwanda to try to achieve that.
Okay, great. And don't you think that will curtail opportunities for people who want probably to work and study in the UK?
No, because those are people coming illegally, often organised by criminal gangs, and that kind of migration, no country, including Kenya, wants that sort of lack of control of its borders. Yes. What we want is for people to come through the routes, through the proper visa process, yes. And then they will have the right to work, live or study in the UK, and that's what we want to support. And the Kenyan diaspora is fantastic. Yes. So the King again hosted a reception for them at Buckingham Palace, yes. Before he came out on his trip, and he told me how impressed he was by the variety of things that they do and the skills that they bring to the UK. Mm-hmm. So we really want to have a vibrant Kenyan diaspora in the UK, but of course we want them to come through legal channels.
Absolutely. And still on that, there's still a follow-up on that. Ask him about what he thinks on cutting immigration to UK and lowering immigration and stopping immigrants' children and spouses from getting dependent visa to UK. Someone says, I think this is unfair.
So we have very high levels of migration to the UK at the moment, and that puts huge strains on public services and on local communities to try to absorb it. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to to control migration and make sure that those people who come to the UK are really adding value when they come to Britain, and that's all that we're trying to do. Okay,
great. And as Kenya marks 60 years of independence tomorrow, indeed, we have very strong ties that we've had for the last 6 decades. But again, the ghost of the past overshadows our relationship. Often, even when the King was here, there were the talks of reparations to the people who were affected during the colonization time. In your view, what can we do for a long-term solution? Because this is something that will keep on coming up as even we continue to strengthen our bilateral ties. What is it that we need to do to solve this once and for all?
So the King addressed these concerns very openly, and I thought in a very impressive way. He talked about it in his speech at the state banquet. He went to visit Uhuru Gardens to see the new museum that's opening there, where Jamhuri Day will be celebrating tomorrow. So he really wanted to see for himself and to see how Kenya is also telling its own history. And he took time to meet with individuals and families and communities which were affected by British rule. So he put a lot of emphasis on this during his visit, and he talked about his regret and the sorrow for what happened. But I would say most Kenyans who he talked to were much more focused on the future. And I think that's something I found all the way here, is I talked to, particularly to young Kenyans, they're very proud of Kenya's past, as they rightfully should be, and they want to talk about it, but they're much more focused on the things that we've talked about now. So can I go and work and study in the UK? Is a British company going to come here? How can British tech help the Kenyan tech sector develop? So we want to be much more focused on the future while talking openly about the past.
Okay.
Some of the issues like abuses committed against some of the Mau Mau fighters, we've been through a full legal settlement already, and we've paid compensation to them, and I'm in touch myself with the Mau Mau Veterans Association. So I think we do much want to be open about the past. We want to talk about that clearly and honestly, and I really respect the way that Kenyans do that. But what I hear from most Kenyans is they really want to focus much more on the future.
Okay, great. And even looking to the future, as we turn 60 years of independence, what is it, what can we look forward to in terms of collaborations, projects, and what the UK has in store for Kenya?
So I think one thing we're building on is really deep people-to-people links. So every year, hundreds of thousands of British people like coming to Kenya. We've talked about the strength of the Kenyan diaspora in the UK. So we really want to keep that going as the basis for everything that we do. So diplomats like me can talk about things, but it really builds on those people-to-people links. But then we want to focus on the future. So we want to focus on technology, we want to focus on scientific collaboration, we want to focus on challenges like climate change and how we can work on that together, and then how we deal with shared threats like the security that we talked about. So that's what we want to do, is to look at, to be a modern partnership of equals, which looks at the world today and where the world is going in the future.
Okay, great. You've mentioned something on our Matters Tech, and just AI, the likes of big data just come to my mind. And I believe the UK is way ahead in terms of technological advancements. Therefore, how can we, even as a country, gain from what you've done so far?
So artificial intelligence is a good example. So we had a big summit in the UK about how we regulate artificial intelligence, this whole big new world, and how we can think about where things will be going in five to 10 years' time when things are already moving so quickly. And so Kenya came to that. We thought it was really important that countries like Kenya come, because they will be facing these challenges as well, but have slightly different challenges. And so building on that, we want to work with Kenya as it looks how to develop regulation about artificial intelligence, but also use the opportunities. And we think artificial intelligence could really help developing countries like Kenya leapfrog in a way and get the maximum benefits for those. So we would like to work with Kenya to see what we could do to help that. And I've been talking to people back in the UK recently about how we can do exactly that.
And any specific projects mostly focusing on the youth?
I think we're still building that. As I say, this is something that's moving very quickly at the moment, but that's why we have the tech hub based here with young Kenyan tech experts, and they can see where some of these opportunities are for practical cooperation.
And 60 years past independence, what is the areas that you think Kenya need to now improve on, even in terms of good governance, matters civil society, matters human rights, respect of human rights, and also matters of just upholding the rule of law?
So I've been hugely impressed by Kenyan civil society that I've seen here. I mean, I think you should be proud of what a strong, confident civil society that you have. On Friday, I was working with women's organisations looking at gender-based violence, and that's sort of the strength with which those organisations confront these issues is really impressive. So I'd say that's a real source of strength, and those organisations act as a real sort of check on the government to try to hold it to high standards. So I think that's really positive. I think the big challenge for Kenya, as many developing countries, and particularly where you've got so many young people, is jobs and growth. And I think that's particularly in the difficult economic circumstances at the moment, I think that's the big challenge. And I think there it's how does Kenya let the potential of the private sector sort of free up a little bit more. And I think that's something that the government is focused on and needs to keep focused on.
Okay, great. And how better do you think we can address the issue of unemployment among the youth? Because there's a huge percentage of the youth that are unemployed currently, and that is why you see even issues of the small insecurities within the city. How can we address that as a country, not only depending on white-collar jobs?
So I think if you create economic growth, you run the economy soundly, you deal with some of the debt issues that we have at the moment, then that provides the stability and that keeps prices down, which will help absolutely everybody. But then it's about reforms sort of at the local level. So we've talked about creating more sort of food processing plants in regions outside Nairobi, which traditionally haven't had much in the way of factories, haven't had much in the way of industry. So I think looking at where you can add value. But as I say, to do that, you need to be reducing regulation so that you can allow, as the government calls it, bottom-up economic growth. So you can let those people start their own businesses without being harassed, without feeling that they're having unfair tax demands and so on, and encourage them to join the formal economy. Because as you said, most people are working in the informal economy at the moment. So if you can get them into the formal economy where they're better protected, where they pay taxes, where they become part of the financial system, they get better access to credit, I think that could create enormous potential. I think with the Hustler Fund, I think has been a good example of bringing together sort of technology to give more Kenyans access to just a bit of money to try to make things better. Okay.
Great, thank you. And of course, we'll be continuing this conversation on the other end after this short commercial break. But of course, you can be part of the conversation at TV47 News on X, TV47 Kenya on Facebook. The hashtag is Morning Cafe. Still watching Morning Cafe, and today we are hosting the British High Commissioner to Kenya, Neil Wigan. And of course, there are array of issues that we're talking about, including matters climate change, matters security, matters trade, and also as we mark 60 years of independence and the long-standing relationship that we've had with the UK, what the envision for the moving forward in matters bilateral relationship between the two countries. And even before we get to that, Neil, there are people who were watching this interview, but they're wondering just a little bit about your growing up background, family background.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I grew up overseas quite a lot. So I spent some of my childhood in Saudi Arabia and then in Hong Kong for a few years. So I've always loved traveling, and I guess that's why I joined the Foreign Ministry. But also I worked as a teacher in Sri Lanka for 2 years. I went to university in Italy for a year, and then I decided I should start to do more serious jobs. So I worked in our central bank and then eventually joined the Foreign Ministry. And I've had the chance to go to some really fascinating places and enjoyed it.
Yeah, perfect. And you've worked in Africa for quite some time. I think it's a role you still hold to date. Yeah. How's it been like working in with African countries?
So, I mean, there's huge differences. So Congo, I mean, is a sort of an enormous, big, complicated country. It's about the size of Western Europe. Kinshasa is going to be the biggest French-speaking city in the world soon. And so I love that sort of diversity, that you can travel around and see all these different things. Somalia was a very different country, much smaller. The Somalis are amazing to work with, very vibrant, very energetic. And it was a period, Somalia was beginning to recover from piracy and the civil war and had driven al-Shabaab out of Mogadishu. So actually, professionally, it was my favorite job almost ever, because even for the difficult conditions they were in, there was a sense of real potential of trying to make things better after a difficult time. And then Kenya is something completely different again. I mean, again, we're talking about sort of technology and artificial intelligence and all these sorts of things, and green investment and green growth. And these aren't really the kind of things I was working so much on in the other countries. So that's the good thing about Africa, is just the enormous diversity between countries, but also, as I said, in Kenya, within country. So going to Lamu or to Kericho or to be here in Nairobi is really a completely different experience.
Yes. I hope you've had a chance to visit the northern part of Kenya. It's quite intriguing.
So that's next on the list, I think.
Oh, perfect. We're looking forward to these updates on X and other social media.
I'm going to go and try and spend some time up in the Aberdares, particularly in January. That's the plan, to go there and then to go up to the northern border a little bit later on as well, I hope.
Perfect. And you've worked in very challenging countries, the likes of Somalia, DR Congo. What is your most challenging moment in all these countries?
So I think in possibly the 2011 elections in Congo, which was Congo's only sort of really second elections since it came out of the civil war. And there was a real worry about instability, that the elections would be fair, that they wouldn't lead to violence in a very tense situation. And we worked really hard with the Congolese government, with international partners, to do the logistics. You're talking about trying to make sure that every Congolese could have the chance to vote, but in places where people were tens of miles through jungle away from from paved roads. So how do you get voting machines and the ability there? How do you make sure that there's not corruption, that there's not voter fraud in these very difficult circumstances, and a result that people can trust? And it wasn't a perfect result, but it made me feel that, yes, we got through the election without massive violence and with a result that was broadly recognized by most Congolese as legitimate, so we could move on to the next stage. I think professionally that was one of the challenging things I've done, but I've worked on crises in Israel, in Lebanon, in all sorts of other countries. And professionally, that's something that puts you under pressure when you have the lives and security of British nationals, as well as the country that you're working in under threat. And that's something that we always want to try to get right. We hope it never happens, but we prepare for it as much as we can.
Absolutely. And when you speak on that DR Congo case, it's pretty much what we see in most African countries, even in Kenya. And I believe by the time we are holding the next general election, you will be still serving as the British High Commissioner to Kenya. Therefore, how do you plan to ensure that we have even a free and fair election, and that is even respects the rule of law despite the outcome of the election? Because these are challenges that we've had before.
Yeah, so we, in all these cases, we want to work with the government, but also with civil society and with the institutions to try to make each election sort of a bit better than the one before. And nobody is perfect. I mean, in Britain, there's controversy about how we do elections in all sorts of ways. So it's not sort of that we have an answer, but the idea is each time you learn the lessons from the last one. So what did you get right in terms of election security and how did the police behave, for example? What did you get wrong? I think in Kenya, the challenge is preparing as long in advance as possible. I think that's a lesson we've learned everywhere, is almost as soon as you finish the first election, you need to start getting into preparations for the next. So I hope that out of the national dialogue and recommendations for what should happen with the Election Commission, that we can start work on those things as soon as possible.
And great, even as you've mentioned something on matters national dialogue, and since you came in, I've seen you've met several leaders, including the opposition leader, Raila Odinga. Recently, I think the most recent one was former President Uhuru Kenyatta. You are with the Deputy President, Rigathi Gachagua, as well. Perhaps could you enlighten us what was the basis of these conversations as far as peace and political stability is concerned?
So we try to talk to politicians, government, opposition. That's part of my job as a diplomat. But to try to understand from them what they see some of the challenges being going forward and what role they think the international community can help. So in many cases, clearly Kenyans sort of know what's best for Kenyans, so the international community can stay back. But are there areas that we can help? But also it's important to talk to, say, to civil society, but to religious leaders. So I've had some very interesting meetings with religious leaders since I came here, people like the Anglican Archbishop, to talk about the role that they can play in helping these processes, and then are there things that we can do to work with them to reinforce and amplify their messages. But I talk to people about a whole range of things. So with former President Kenyatta, also he has a role in mediating in Eastern DRC, and that's something that I have a particular interest in. So we talked about that as well. And with the Deputy President, we talked about things from encouraging Kenyan exports to how we're going to work on El Nino and the support that we hope that we can give. So domestic politics is important, but there's a whole range of other things to talk about as well.
Absolutely, and even as we speak on matters, El Nino it's here, and it's not something that people had anticipated, because we had just come from a drought that was the worst, that hit Kenya the worst for the last 40 years. So in terms of looking for a long-term solution, so that whenever these disasters face us, we are able to deal with it immediately and not waiting for the disaster to happen, then we start looking for the solutions. What is it that Kenya needs to do?
So I think that's exactly right. It's about building resilience so that when these things happen, the systems are in place to mitigate the effects and to help to recover as quickly as possible. Actually, we think Kenya's done a good job of that, and we're testing that in El Nino. And we are much more looking forward at how we sort of most of the problems are being dealt with by the county governments with the support of the national government. And there's not really needed to be such a role for the international community. And I think that's a sign of success in what Kenya is doing. But again, it's about learning the lessons, because we are, with climate change, I think we will more and more be in this cycle of extreme drought, then moving to extreme floods. And so how do you change economic systems? How do you change government systems? How do you work with local communities to make things as resilient as possible, whether it's about how to keep livestock alive, to dealing with the impact of floods on roads. So how can you make sure that goods are getting where you need to get them? As I say, next week, or so this week actually, I want to go and visit some communities which have been directly affected to see what we can do in the short term, but as you say, how can we build those systems for the long term?
Okay, great. And could you just elaborate to us some key areas of collaboration between the two nations in terms of strengthening democratic institutions, good governance, and also upholding the rule of law?
So through the last elections, we had a big program which offered support to a whole array of Kenyan institutions, and everything from how should the police behave, how should they provide security, to supporting civil society. So how can, and that's whether supporting big civil society organizations, but also, for example, on the coast, we worked with religious leaders, bringing communities together to avoid some of the tensions that we've seen with, between communities in areas like the coast. And now we've finished that program, and now we're going to design a new program. We've worked for a long time on devolution in Kenya. We think that's been a big success, a really successful program, providing technical support with Kenya to try to get the best out of devolution and build government at the local level. And then we're trying to move some of our programs to be working much more with county governments on the ground to see what works and how we can help them develop their local economies.
Okay, perfect. And devolution hit 10 years actually in Kenya right now. And yes, there are so many wins, but against there are also areas that we've missed on. What is it that we need to do in order to make sure, as we celebrate another decade of devolution, that it works actually?
So again, I mean, in Britain, we have this ongoing discussion as well about what should the role be of local government and at different levels, what should the role of central government be, and that's an ongoing discussion. We think that will happen everywhere and certainly will keep on happening in Kenya. But I say, when I do go, I've met governors of a lot of the counties that I've been to and try to understand what some of their challenges are. Resources is always a big challenge, but it's how can they really compete with each other and how can they share best practice with each other so that you can see what's going on in Kilifi, could that be adopted in Taita Taveta or the other way around. And we think that sort of sharing of information and best practice is where you can really start to see the benefits, that you would see this model works, this model doesn't. But I think a big part of it is, as I said, is about spreading economic growth. Yes. You've got areas where you really just exported raw products to the centre and out. So how can you develop their technology centres, how can you develop manufacturing centres? And again, I think that's something that can be that, and how do you, I think one of the benefits of devolution is you have local governments who should feel much more accountable to the citizens, and so under much more pressure to be right at the edge of those things and finding opportunities.
Brilliant. And looking forward, what strategies does the UK prioritise in fostering regional stability, especially regarding cross-border issues, matters trade, and also regional cooperation?
So part of this is about security, and as I said, and we think an important thing is to help Kenyan troops and other security forces prepare for the threats that they face, and to use our troops as well who are in the region to see what we can do together to provide that stability. We're running a project at the moment which I'm particularly interested in, called the Borderlands Project, which is working with Somalia, Ethiopia and Kenya to try to increase security, but also help to develop local economies and support local communities in those areas. Because we think the more you have a stronger economy, communities which will feel well supported in those areas, then that will help to keep the terrorists and the radicals out.
And in terms of regional cooperation and trade, just ensuring we have perhaps even regionally, how do we ensure that we have a borderless Africa when it comes to matters trade?
So we want to work both at the continental level, so with the African Union on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, but that's a long-term aspiration. So for now, we're working very closely with the East African community to see how that can really increase trade integration in the region. So we welcome the fact that Somalia joined last week. So how can we, not last month, sorry. So how can we use that to sort of keep on promoting regional trade? We have a free trade agreement with Kenya, but we'd like to integrate that more so it becomes more of a free trade agreement with the region if we possibly can. And then for a long time, we've sponsored an organisation called Trademark Africa, and that works exactly to try to remove some of the practical difficulties, whether it's infrastructure or lack of customs facilities or trade processes, which are getting in the way of trade. Because we look at the numbers and we think there's potential for much more trade between African countries than we're seeing at the moment.
Okay, perfect. And of course, I'll do injustice if I don't speak on matters women and girls. Yes, I saw when the King visited and the Queen, so the Queen met with the CS for gender and their issues of just empowerment of women and girls. Are there any programs that have been set in place in matters empowering women and girls in the country?
So we have, under British law, all the development programmes that we have to look at the gender impact of everything that we do. So whether it's in technology or humanitarian assistance or economic development, we have to look at the gender impact and how that will affect women and girls. And a lot of the aid that we give, both to Kenya directly, but also to organisations like the UN, that has to have women and girls at the centre of that. So we think this is absolutely vital. And then when there are specific areas, we talked about gender-based violence, we want to support those areas. And so the Queen went to somewhere in Mombasa, which supports the survivors of gender-based violence. She talked to some of the survivors and talked about some of the work that she does with people facing the same problems in the UK. So we absolutely think this is something really important to work on.
Yeah, and we just completed the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Therefore, in what ways is the High Commission working to address gender-based disparities in education as well as employment opportunities?
So in education, absolutely. We think we want to get primary education, and that therefore particularly means making sure that girls, who often in many countries, and Kenya actually has a relatively good record on this, that they get the access to get primary education, but then to carry on even further. And as I said, all the programs we do have to make sure that the rights of women and girls are fully respected.
And as a country, what strategies or policies do you think should be put in place to ensure that we encourage women and girls and the youth as well to participate in matters leadership?
So I've met some extremely impressive Kenyan women, so I'm not sure they really need any advice from me. They seem to be doing a pretty fantastic job as it is already.
But the issue of gender inequality when it comes to representation...
So I think I think that's why I talk about primary education. You need to start at the beginning to make sure that girls get the right to go to primary school and get that education, and then try to keep it going on all the way through. We've seen in countries across the world that the best indicator of how women will perform economically, politically, and in leadership roles later in life is whether they have the right and the ability to access education. We think that's absolutely fundamental.
Okay. Perfect. And even as we foster this strong relationship between Kenya and the UK, what do you aim to do in order to ensure that the opportunities that are offered, even in terms of financial inclusion, matters economic, matters politics, that even these minority groups are reached too?
So yeah, but I think our role is supporting Kenyan institutions in leading that. And again, we look at issues like the national dialogue, how it looked at, for example, the two-thirds gender rule, and see are there things that we can do to support individual institutions. So, for example, you had some British members of Parliament came out to Kenya quite recently, and they were talking with Kenyan parliamentarians about what can you do to help women progress in Parliament. But I've met, you have a female Chief Justice. She's a phenomenal role model for people in the legal profession. So are there things that we can do, again, to support role models like that, to encourage people so people can see the path? I had a fascinating dinner at my house with Kenyan women involved in national security, and that's everything from people in the army, in the intelligence service, in the police service, but also working on cybercrime and so on, about, are there things that we can do in that sector, which tends to be male-dominated, to open it up so that women have a good place there. And again, there were hugely impressive people around the table. And it's great that you have a female national security advisor as well.
Yes, it's interesting you've mentioned matters cyber security and cyber crimes. This year alone, we have faced a couple of them as a nation, even in government services and also at a personal level. How do we as a country and also as a region, because I believe it's like an African kind of problem, how do we prepare for such threats now that there's a lot of technological advancement and we can't ignore it?
So, I mean, we have the same threats as well. I mean, I think it's a global problem as everything moves online, but also as criminals and as hostile state actors, more and more see cyberspace as a key competition space. We're seeing this, for example, in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where cyberspace has really become sort of the fourth dimension of conflict. So, again, we see huge potential for sharing information. So, in Britain, we have something called the National Cyber Security Centre, part of one of our intelligence agencies, but we think we see scope for them to do much more cooperation and sharing of experience with Kenya. And again, Kenya, because of its tech expertise, can then become a regional centre and spread best practice across Africa.
Yes.
And we'd like to work with Kenya as well in areas of global regulation, because it's important that these new technologies, that there's the right global regulation and the right standards in place. We've talked about artificial intelligence already, but we think around cyber technologies, again, Kenya can play an important part in setting standards for Africa and making sure Africa has a stake in the world debate.
Okay, great. Let's come back. 60 years, we're hitting 60 years tomorrow. It's Jamhuri.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And how does the UK reflect the 6-decade relationship that we've had in terms of social, economic, and also political milestones?
So very positively. I mean, I think almost from the moment of independence, Kenya made clear that despite some of the difficult history, it still wanted to have a close relationship with Britain, politically, economically, and in terms of security. And I'm really proud that we've maintained that through 60 years, and Britain remains one of Kenya's closest partners. We don't take that for granted. We know that lots of other people also want to come to Kenya and want to close partnerships with Kenya. Yeah. So there's some healthy competition to us to make sure that Britain still is seen as that really close partner. But that's what I feel it is. And again, when I talk to Kenyans, their enthusiasm to work, study, live, go on holiday in the UK, which football teams they support, those links are really strong, and that's what we want to keep.
Yeah. What football team do you support in the APL, by the way?
So the terrible truth is that I'm not a huge football fan. I know I should never admit that as a British ambassador, but in Britain you play rugby or football at school, so I pick rugby.
Okay, perfect. Moving forward, how do you envision deepening the bilateral relationship and collaboration in the coming years?
So part of this is around the strategic partnership, and that sets out 5 pillars agreed between our Prime Minister and your President, and that's areas like sustainable development, climate change, security and stability, and economic growth, as well as tech and people to people. So there's that formal architecture. But behind that, it's important that we keep building the people to people links and the economic links, which really underpin everything that our governments do, and then the security links, because the top priority for any government must be protecting its people. And where we have a security agreement with Kenya, which covers everything from cybercrime to police, and then a defence cooperation agreement as well, to make sure that we are natural partners on protecting each other's people.
And from a personal level, as a diplomat for the period that you'll be serving, what are the key things that you want to see addressed within your period of serving?
So one thing I think is green investment. I think that's something I've become really excited about since I came to Kenya. And people talk about green growth and how do we face climate change. And the fact that Kenya sort of sees this as an opportunity and sees potential there is something really exciting. So that's something I would really like to focus on. And then as well, sort of development outside, sort of across the country.
Yes.
And that's why I put this big emphasis on us working with county governments and on myself getting out and about and seeing where there's potential to make sure that growth benefits all bits of Kenya.
Perfect. And even as we wrap up, I'd like to ask some quick fire questions as we finish. What's your best Kenyan food?
Oh, nyama choma, I have to say.
Interesting. Do you have a hobby or a talent, what you do beyond your official duties?
So usually I would say running, but in Kenya the standard of running is so high I don't feel I can really compete, but that's my next objective, is to do my first half marathon in Kenya. Oh,
perfect. And what's your favorite kind of music that you jam to?
So I have terrible taste in music, and my children just laugh at me relentlessly, and they call it dad rock. So I guess sort of, rock of the 60s and 70s is probably most of what I listen to. So.
Favorite one?
Whatever Spotify tells me at the moment, I'm trying to get away from it. Yeah. Tom Petty at the moment.
Okay, perfect. Have you had any Kenyan music so far?
So actually, that's something I haven't done. So one thing which I do want Kenyans to do is to give me more recommendations of films, TV series, books and things, so I can sort of get into Kenyan culture in a different way. Yeah,
you'll get brilliant ones. I'll give you hints after we finish up. And best destination in Kenya so far?
Lamu is my favorite so far.
Perfect. How many languages do you speak? And any Swahili that you've gotten
So Swahili, that is my New Year's resolution for 2024, is to start learning Swahili properly and to get myself a proper Swahili teacher. At the moment, I've English, French, and some Hebrew is all I speak.
Perfect. Let's just wrap up with you giving a message to Kenya as she turns 60 years.
So happy birthday.